required on the computer. And it's recorded. Okay. Here.
I'll take the list, but I'll just tell you, I have started getting better, and I'm just about, well, I don't want to say better. The amount of pain, the amount of discomfort I have is nothing. It's more like stuff you kind of expect as you get old. It's been a strange ride, but I can tell you that I appreciate feeling good more than I did 2 months ago, in a way that I can't even describe. I appreciate Mary more than I did 2 months ago. All of you more than, and I will tell you, there are some of those, some of us who are online. Kelly is not on today, but Cheryl and Kelly are both dealing with very similar problems to what I've had. They're both in a lot of pain. And I understand something that I didn't understand 2 months ago. And so we want to make sure. Cheryl did get some good news this week. She had a bunch of scans and they're not finding any.
Still looking for stuff.
Yeah, still looking, but they're not finding signs of a return of that cancer or, an expansion of it. So it is good news, but she is dealing with pain. She's dealing with, something very similar to what I was going through. And Kelly, I knew that she was in a wreck and I knew that it was bad, but I didn't understand that she is in constant daily pain. And I hope she gets this and is able to hear. But both Cheryl and Kelly, keep them in your prayers. The constant pain. I don't know if despair is the right word. It almost got to the point of panic. I just want away from this. And I know that's the same thing they're going through. Last week, we talked about Robin Hazard's brother. His name is Jim Allen, and he has had a return of pancreatic cancer. And those are words you don't want to hear. So Jim Allen, keep him in your prayers and in ours. Alton is getting worse. He's bedridden now, and it's a tremendously difficult time for both him and for Kathy. And it's almost the same with Cherie and Phil. Don't forget them. Please don't forget them in your prayers. God, we try to remember to come thankful. And yet we have times when things don't go our way that we forget to be thankful. We forget to notice that the world you've built is good. That there are good things and good people, and we sometimes close that out. Becomes difficult to see. And we always try to remember to come in prayer, to remember to be thankful for all you've done. But primarily what we're discussing today is the gift of your son, the atonement, the sacrifice. We should always be able to find room for grateful hearts for that. We struggle to go through the scriptures to find the understanding of what we should do about some of these things. Help us always. Be with us as we study. Amen.
Okay, we are on the third week of a 4-week study on the Passover. And I'm going to let Scott talk a little bit about, what the purpose is, if you will. But where we left the first week, we looked at the original Passover, which was Exodus 12. And then last week, we looked at 5 additional passages in the Old Testament where the celebration of the Passover was mentioned. And I want to emphasize that it wasn't celebrated every year because the people did not do what God had asked them to do, but it was celebrated many, many, many more times than 5 times. So those were the times that was mentioned in the Old Testament. The last time that it was mentioned, we read in Ezra 6, which was 535 years before Jesus was born. Do you want to give a little thing about where we're going or what?
Yeah, and I want to say, Mary and I talk a lot. We don't want to teach a history class. It's good to know history if it reveals something. I mean, we there's plenty of history books, but understanding the history sometimes helps us understand what's required of us, the things that we need to know. And so these other instances where we see the Passover mentioned in the Bible, what we see is that people sort of began to write their own version of this. And let me say, some of the things, some of the times where they got off script, where they sort of wrote their own, you can see that they had good intentions a lot of the time. It began, and a lot of bad habits are born of good intentions. And so, they had a difficult time carrying out the Passover feast and remembrance the way it was supposed to be. So they just changed it to be easier. And something's lost every time. And we're guilty of the same thing. But one of the big questions I wanted to ask this week, this is sort of the, after those first two, is what are we expected to do on Easter? What are this? And the other question is, and maybe it should have come first, are Easter and Passover the same thing? Anyone? Are Easter and Passover the same thing? Anyone at home? Want to click in? Huh?
Well, not literally. Spiritually, it's one right before the other. But you go back to the Old Testament, it's been here all along.
We're studying Passover and we're coming up on Easter, which is no coincidence, but I'll put it up there again. Are Easter and Passover the same thing?
Well, all I was going to say is Easter, we're celebrating the resurrection of Jesus Christ. And Passover is them being delivered from bondage in Egypt, technically.
They're not the same thing. They are two very much related things that take place at the same time. And if we've given the impression that what holds for Passover holds for Easter, they support each other. They're there to the first one to make you see the second one. They are not the same thing. And so then the question is, what are we required to do at Easter? And some of you are not going to like the answer. Nothing. We're required to do nothing at Easter. Absolutely right, Gene. He's already done it. And it is not to say that there aren't things that we could do or maybe even should do. But we have no requirements the way Israel had requirements for Passover. But understanding what they were doing and what they were told to do reveals an awful lot about what's intended for us right now. And I will say, when I say nothing, and when Mary and I talked about this, we are required to do nothing at Easter and everything. He gives us this, at the Last Supper, which is a Passover celebration. He says, this is new. We're starting something new here. And I'm giving you a new commandment. This is a new covenant in my blood. So the old is part of the old covenant, which God doesn't abandon his covenants. But now I'm giving this as a new covenant, and I'm giving you a new commandment. And he says, love one another. And it is the simplest and yet the most difficult of all the commandments. So keep that in mind today, that there are a lot of things that we are free to. We can have a Seder. We can have a Passover Seder. There's nothing that says you can't, but that's not required of us. And there are no instructions. There are people who go through and try and pick out a little half a sentence and say, see, that proves we're supposed to do this and this. And it just, you read it and it just doesn't say that. So let's go into this today. I wanted to get to, especially this third week, with the understanding that what is required of us versus, as Paul says, all things are legal, but not all things are profitable. Not all things benefit us. We want to look maybe at some of the things that will benefit us. What do we get out of Easter, and what does Passover tell us about that?
And can you touch on the question of whether they're mutually exclusive?
They are absolutely not mutually exclusive. And you know, I've mentioned it, but I'll mention it again. The similarities between the two are almost frightening. And it's on purpose, because the Passover remembrance was established. What happens at Passover? The blood saves you, and it saves them from death that you know the rest of the country experiences. And what are the similarities to that? Well, of course we see the similarities to Easter. We're supposed to. They're absolutely not mutually exclusive. The other big thing, I guess, that and maybe I even shouldn't, but we do see ways that they sort of forgot the main idea. The Israel sort of made it more convenient and forgot what they were really supposed to be doing. And I would submit we've done a lot the same thing around Easter.
And you know, the amazement of this book. Remember, we started with the idea that, yes, we started with the Exodus, but it says in the Bible that on the 14th of Nisan, that's when Abraham was instructed to sacrifice his son Isaac, and God stepped in and gave a substitute for that sacrifice. That happened on the 14th of Nisan. Then there was the Exodus, or the Passover meal, the night before they left Egypt. And then now we're talking about Jesus' life and the Last Supper.
And so maybe this is a lot at the beginning, but maybe also keep in mind that as we study Passover, a lot of other people study Passover, and they like to get on the days and say, well, if this happened on Friday, then it's only 2 days, only 3. If you look at the similarities between Passover and what we call Easter, that's Jesus' sacrifice. If you look at all the ways they line up, it's uncanny. And if you want to get down and say, well, you know, that would have been 6 hours after this, therefore the timing is wrong, please don't do that. If you can look at how amazingly Passover presents what's about to happen here in Jerusalem, I don't know how you could get any more identical, really, how you could match it up any better. They're there for a reason.
So let's get started. Sorry.
No, I'm on a roll. I want to mention one other thing, and this is current events, because we've said part of what we want to do is be sure, and let's talk about what we do about some of this today. All of you know about AI, right? You're hearing nothing but AI everywhere, and they have these things. You can ask it a question, or you can describe something, and it'll draw you a picture of it. In China right now, they're rewriting the Bible. A lot of you don't know that, but the Chinese Communist Party has said that the Bible, these Christians say things that are not useful for the Chinese Communist Party. They're damaging. So we don't want you teaching the Bible the way it is. And so the CCP, the party, has literally come in, and you can look it up. This is not Uncle Scott making it up. This is not conspiracy theory. They have said, ooh, some of these passages just have to go. You're going to need to say it like this, because now it sounds like communist doctrine. And they are ravenously eating their way through the scriptures in China. And a lot of people, I personally know some people that risked a lot to put Bibles into China, and they're taking them up when they can, but they're rewriting them. The next generation will know a different truth. That's the idea. Yes, sir.
Just ask a question. The Chinese government does not in any way, shape, or form support religious freedom.
Correct.
So what are they gonna do when they rewrite their version of the Bible? They're gonna start passing them out like we're now Christian wannabes?
I didn't start this really talking about China so much and get into that kind of discussion. This is sort of mid-thought. But yeah, they don't mind once they've rewritten it, then it's a social commentary and they'll pass it out to everybody because it will no longer be a Bible. Why did I start with AI? Those of you who are inclined to study scriptures on your own, don't do it with AI. Just don't, because it returns information. It gives you an answer. But I saw one, this week, they've been on one of the AI sites. They said, draw me a picture of the Pope, and it drew an African-American woman. And so, well, that's fine, except that's not who that is. And if you begin rewriting scriptures, then a lot is lost. And all of these things that we're talking about are related because over time, the Passover was rewritten.
And some of the things and we'll get started here, but is that even that we're taught in churches, we didn't go deep enough to some of these, and we have lost some things about what's already written.
We certainly have. There's the point. Now we can get started.
Okay. So the word Passover appears 26 times in the New Testament because I like numbers. And a lot of them is like in the same passage, it's 3 or 4 times. So I did give you with the invitation this week, the sightings or the areas where there was talking about the Passover. The first one we want to talk about today is Luke 2, verses 41 and 42. And Luke is the only one that talks about Jesus going to the temple when he is 12 years old. So I just want to, every year, I'm in Luke 2, verse 41. Every year his parents went to Jerusalem for the feast of the Passover. And when he was 12 years old, they went up according to the custom of the feast. When those days were over and they were returning home, the boy Jesus remained behind in Jerusalem, but his parents were unaware that he had stayed.
Passover.
Yep, it's Passover. A couple of interesting things on this that I'm just going to let you know. At this time, Jewish law at this time required every adult male living within 25 miles of Jerusalem to go to Jerusalem for Passover and for the Feast of Unleavened Bread and for 2 other feast days. So at this time, it was still an 8-day feast, the Passover and the Feast of Unleavened Bread, but they had combined it basically to one. And so sometimes it's even referred to in the Bible as the Feast of Unleavened Bread. Sometimes it's referred to Passover, an 8-day festival. But bottom line, remember the way God talked about it to Moses, it was the Passover was 1 day, and then the Feast of Unleavened Bread was 7 days. But the other thing, so Bethlehem was less than 25 miles from Jerusalem, which Scott says, yeah, I knew that. And I'm thinking, we even lived there. And I thought it was more than that. So that makes sense that Jesus and his family went up to Jerusalem every year for the Feast of the Passover. They'd go up by a caravan. Another thing, we have a book on the historical traditions of the Bible. And when you travel in a caravan, they said at that time, the first day of the caravan, they would only travel like 3 miles or 8 miles, something like that. And then they would stop. And the reason they would do it is because if anybody forgot anything, somebody could go home and get it. And so, because I'm thinking to myself, a day's travel, the reason they chose it has to be less than 25 miles for anybody to come. That was considered the longest you could travel in 25 days. But then in a day, sorry. But then when I'm looking at this story about Jesus going up as a 12-year-old, and then remember on the way home, that first night, that's when they realized Jesus was missing, and Mary and Joseph went back to Jerusalem. I'm thinking, if it's only one day's travel, it didn't make any sense to me, but now it makes sense. So when they travel in the caravan, the first day they only go 5-8 miles. They stop, make sure they have everybody and everything, and it makes sense. They didn't have Jesus, so Mary and Joseph had to go back. So that's the little tidbit. Passover one. Passover trivia. Leave me alone. Okay. 12, yes, in the fact that by 12, and we actually read this in the same custom book, by 5, males would have been asked to be able to recite things. By 12, they were almost considered a man.
They are considered
a man. 12. 12. Yeah. So he was considered, yes. So it was, but so, that's all to say, Jesus was raised as a good Jewish boy, and he went up there and was celebrating as a good Jewish boy as the way they were celebrating it. And as Scott said, remember, even when we got to Ezra, remember, it started to be, you sacrifice something, you go out on the 10th day, you pick out a lamb, and on the 14th day, when the sun sets, you kill that lamb. On the 14th night, you eat that lamb. On the 14th night, you eat all of that lamb within your house. If it's too much for your house, you get your neighbors next door, but it's a very intimate thing, and you go out and make the sacrifice. It has turned into, you go to the temple, you buy a lamb from the temple, there's lines up of people lining up to get their lamb slaughtered, and then you go back to your house, but you are not doing the sacrifice, you're buying the sacrifice. Correct? Is that a correct way to look at it?
That is it.
Okay. The second one I want to look, go ahead.
Let's mention one thing. If the question here today we're looking for is, what are we required to do? Is there anything in here that says that you must do this? There are people who tell us that even though we're not bound by the law, we should continue to follow the law. We should eat kosher. We should do all these things. Even though we're technically not under the law, we should do it. And if you go out online, you will find hundreds of them pretty quickly that we should be still following the law. So what if we were to tell you that today at Easter time, you should go out on the 10th
That's a good question.
as a good Christian, as a descendant of Israel, they'll tell you, and pick out a lamb. And then on the 14th, slaughter that lamb with your own hands, sprinkle some of the blood around. And what if we were to tell you, you have to do all these things? Nobody's going to do it. Not one of you is going to go do that. Well, where is the value in saying this is what you need to do when you know it's not gonna get done? So we need to go looking for, if we are required, we may need a change of heart to say, we don't like doing it, but this is what we're supposed to do. Again, we'll look at what does happen in Jerusalem, and you'll see that it's just not that way.
Okay, so the next big time that the Passover is mentioned is the Last Supper. Now, I want you to take into account everything we have learned with how they're supposed to do it and how the early church is doing it. Oh, the one other thing, that at this time, the Jews during Jesus's time were not celebrating it on the 14th of Nisan. They were celebrating it on the 15th of Nisan. So we did a lot of research. So at Ezra's time, 536 years ago, they were celebrating it on the 14th. At Jesus's time, they were celebrating it on the 15th. In 2024, Jews are celebrating it on the 15th. Okay. How did it get from the 14th to the 15th? Oh, we don't know. But there is some thought that it happened, what was the years that I came up with? 300, somewhere between 300 and 200 BC. So after Ezra, but 200 years before Jesus, they changed the date. Why they changed the date? They ended up making it one holiday, and they did the sacrifice on the 15th of Nisan. Okay, keep that in mind as we read this part.
So not only did they limit the Feast of Unleavened Bread to one day, but then they brought in the Passover.
The other way around. They made the Passover, made the Passover one day, and the Feast of Unleavened Bread, they shortened. So they've made it like 7 days instead of 8 days. It should have been 1 and then 7 days. Now it's 7 days, a day later. And so everybody says that, you know, and there's, if you look up Nisan 14 and 15, oh my gosh, you can read forever. But what we know is today, Jews celebrate the Passover on the 15th of Nisan. I would love to sit down with somebody and say, how do you do that? And they probably wouldn't know, just like we don't know a lot of the things that Christians believe. But Jews celebrate it on the 15th, and it is believed very strongly. And Josephus, which is one of the big historians of the time, they celebrated on the 15th of Nisan now, which is like, wow.
So when we say celebrate, or when they say in the Bible, in the New Testament, celebrate Passover, the question you should ask is, whose Passover? Because the Jewish Passover is on the 15th. God's Passover, the one he told them, is the 14th. So they can say they were celebrating Passover, and you have to say, well, they were. And then you also have to look at what's here in Exodus. And is it important, the 14th versus the 15th? This was established to keep them commemorating and remembering the deliverance that God brought them. And it keeps them one people, but it makes sure that this isn't ever forgotten. And remember, they're spread out all over the world, right? Jews, the diaspora, they're everywhere. This, if they celebrated it right, if they observed it the right way, starting on the 14th, then every Jew in the whole world, no matter where they're located, will be doing the same thing at the same time. Okay, we account for time zones, but you get the idea that this makes sure that the entire nation of Israel remembers, never forgets their deliverance from the land of Egypt. And they do it the same way at the same time, and they are one people. Now, that seems to me like a pretty good thing. I would think most of us would say, well, you know, I mean, that seems to have some value. But what they said was, you know, it's kind of like what happens when 4th of July comes on a Sunday. We don't really get a day off for the judge, so we just extend it. You know, I mean, these are the things we do. Well, we'll just do it on Monday. And I'm not saying it's bad, but for the purpose of Passover, it was designed so that it would always occur the same way. They were told to do that. And then they just said, well, it's not very practical. We would like to have a nice, compact 1 week, you know, celebration. So they just changed it. And invariably, inevitably, things are lost when we start doing that.
Yep. Everybody sells it on the 15th.
I might as well here. You know, this is not going exactly. We did talk about this. When we were in Israel, we had a very Orthodox, devout family. The wife worked with us at the company. She's an attorney. She'd come from New York and moved over.
To live a Jewish life.
To live a devout Jewish life. But when she invited us, they invited us for a Seder at their house. You know, I mean, a Shabbat celebration.
Friday night.
And she's telling us two things stuck out at me. Her husband was, you know, during the day, he was working, he's doing stuff. And she was explaining that if he didn't do a certain thing by a certain time, bad luck would follow him home for Shabbat. And then the other thing that just I wasn't prepared for, she was in the kitchen getting things ready for the Seder dinner. And there's some part of this, if she didn't get that done by a certain time, the Queen of Shabbat would not appear. And yeah, go look up Queen of Shabbat and see if you can make heads or tails. It is, it's complicated, and a lot of people tell different stories. The Queen of Shabbat does not appear. And so what I'm trying to get across is that we humans have a tendency to write our own story. And they had taken Passover and sort of rewritten it. And it's a lot of the time it's not out of bad intention, but it still changes things. And then all today, let's keep taking it back to the celebration of Easter. We might want to question, have we done any similar things with Easter?
Okay, I am now on in Luke, in chapter 22, verse 7. Then came the day of unleavened bread, on which the Passover lamb was to be sacrificed. Jesus sent Peter and John, saying, "Go and prepare for us to eat the Passover." "Where do you want us to prepare it?" they asked. He answered, "When you enter the city, a man carrying a jug of water will meet you. Follow him to the house he enters, and say to the owner of that house, 'The teacher asked, where is the guest room where I may eat the Passover with my disciples?' And he will show you a large upper room already furnished. Make preparations there." So they went and found it just as Jesus had told them, and they prepared the Passover. When the hour had come, Jesus reclined at the table with his disciples, and he said to them, "I have eagerly desired to eat this Passover with you before my suffering. For I tell you, I will not eat it again until it is fulfilled in the kingdom of God." After taking the cup, he gave thanks and said, "Take this and divide it among yourselves. For I tell you that I will not drink of the fruit of the vine from now until the kingdom of God comes." And he took the bread, gave thanks, and broke it, and gave it to them, saying, "This is my body given for you. Do this in remembrance of me." In the same way, after supper, he took the cup, saying, "This cup is the new covenant in my blood, which is poured out for you. Look, the hand of my betrayer is," oh, that's as far as I was going to read. That's right.
So, here's a description of the Last Supper, and we're going to get to that. But he breaks bread. Jesus breaks bread. Do all of you have a picture of Jesus taking a loaf of bread and sort of pulling it apart? Because that's what we do
With
at communion, right? Remember that this is to remember to commemorate the original Passover, and they were not to leaven their bread. That's what a matzah is. It's a cracker. It is basically, it's an overcooked tortilla, right? It's so cooked so much that if you've ever left one on long enough, it's hard. Why are Passover and the Feast of Unleavened Bread, why are they two different things? Anyone? Why are they two different things? The bread wasn't unleavened. No, it was leavened. That all the way back there at the very beginning, Passover is not the same thing as the Feast of Unleavened Bread. Why?
Because it was traveling. It's supposed to be commemorating the urgency of getting out of it.
So when we talk about what does Gene just said, they were traveling. They were expected to be traveling. When we talk about what does Passover have in store for us with Easter, remember what happens here. They are captive. They are bound, right? No hope. And God delivers them. And he tells them all through that before the last plague, he says, this time he's letting you go. Get ready. This time he's letting you go. He never said that before. But they're told to have this unleavened bread because they're going to be traveling. Gene, that's a good answer. Look at what that tells us about our life. We have this moment of taking on, of accepting the sacrifice of Jesus. And we're told that in order to take part in this eternal kingdom, that's what we're supposed to do. But what happens then? This is one of my sort of passion moments. This is one of the things that really gets me stirred up, because what has happened in churches all over the world for 2 millennia is we act like once we're saved, once we accept, it's all over. Done. I'm good. Wait, you're telling me I'm okay? I can just, okay, now I can go do whatever because I'm taken care of. At the moment that happens, life begins. When there's a deliverance from death, at that moment, life begins. You have an entire lifetime here that we're told we're supposed to do things that bear fruit. Yes? The Feast of Unleavened Bread says, okay, God delivered you the night before. He came and he made preparation for your deliverance. Now you're going to have to go walk out through the desert with tortillas, right? With matzahs. You're going to have to learn to trust. You're going to have to walk and so there are things here that mirror our experience in ways that are mind-boggling. So they're separate because they are two different things. There is the moment that the blood delivers the people of Israel, and then they begin their journey. Struggling with that, Gene?
Yeah, I'm puzzled because I'm seeing 2 different levels. I'm seeing the original coming in with physical slavery, working, making bricks. Now, past Jesus, we've got a spiritual slavery that we need to break and have the faith.
Correct.
They had a preliminary problem. I've got to survive. I got to take care of my family, try to be as good as I can. But I've got to live another day until this promise that's coming that 400 years never got here. Bunch of people died, all with the expectation of the Savior coming, and he doesn't come out. He gets his commitment. He says, tomorrow you got to be ready to go because I'm going to liberate.
Is your mic on, by the way? Are you people hearing him at home? They're not hearing you. You got to get that mic on. People are not hearing you. So there are 2, he says there are 2 levels here, that those people had a physical, hold it in until it turns green. Gene said those people had physical bondage. We have a spiritual bondage. Did those people all that time at the original Passover also have a spiritual problem?
Yeah.
Is there any difference?
Trust and faith.
There is no difference. The point of the Passover the whole time was to point forward. It's the foreshadowing of this event. And what it does do is it reminds them, it shows them God's deliverance. It shows them the blood. It lays this Jerusalem once for all sacrifice out for us so incredibly that it would be hard to miss. Did they have physical bondage? Of course they did. But this is about what happens in Jerusalem from the beginning.
But it is a question raised by the child. Why do we celebrate this? Why do we go through all this
Passover.
What's different about this night?
Last Supper.
The Seder meal. Why do we do this? Well, because we did it really for the emotional, the spiritual thing, not the physical thing.
I don't want to get lost in this. There are a lot of things going on. There are There it is. And we are, and Mary's over here. You guys can't see, Mary's over here elbowing me underneath. And I have to respect that because she's right. The point I'm trying to make is that the Passover serves, and Gene's right, two levels. It serves two purposes. It does. Today we're looking at how it foreshadows, how it mirrors Jesus' sacrifice, because ultimately that's what's important about it.
So what I believe after studying this and the timing, and there's also controversy if you read, so Matthew, Mark, and Luke, remember they're the synoptic gospels, and it's because they tell things the same way, sort of, and John is a very different gospel, right? John, remember that Last Supper goes on for like 6 chapters because he does all this teaching during that time. So it's hard to tell the story. And when you see it in John, it starts in chapter 13. It doesn't talk about the preparation, but it does say it was just before the Passover feast, and Jesus knew that his hour had come to leave the world and to return to his Father. And so he invited people, and so people want to say that John's Last Supper was just a feast of love, and it was at a different time. When I line up all these things, what I think is Jesus went back and celebrated the Passover the way it was supposed to be done. It was Nisan 14. Okay. And he did it on Nisan 14. He told his disciples, and you could just see, remember, they don't write down every word, but I'm just picturing them. He's telling whoever he told, Peter, and to go prepare for it. And they're like, it's a day early. What do you mean? We got to go to the temple and pick up the lamb. He says, no, you guys prepare for it. We're going to prepare for the Last Supper. They did it the right way. They went there, they slaughtered the lamb, they had the Last Supper, they ate all the food before they left to go to the Garden of Gethsemane. So in our way, we celebrated. It's Thursday night, guys. This all happened Thursday night. This was Thursday morning where he says, go get the lamb, slaughter it. We'll be there in a couple of hours to celebrate the Last Supper. So it is not inconsistent, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John's gospel when it talks about it, first of all. So I think, and think about it, Jesus was not here to rewrite the law. He was here to fulfill the law. He went back and did it like the law was supposed to be done. And he did it with this intimate group of people. This was his family. These were his disciples. They're in this, and as Scott says, he knew he was going to die Friday afternoon, which was still really the 14th Nisan. He knew he was going to be crucified that night. And he was going to tell everybody, I mean, his disciples, it was the last word. I'm leaving you. I want to tell you some things. And so John goes into a lot of detail of all the teachings he went in. And one of the teachings I want to read, and you want me to, is I'm on John 15, verses 14. So this is during this Last Supper meal. You are my friends if you do what I command you. No longer do I call you servants, for a servant does not understand what his master is doing. But I've called you friends, because everything I have learned from my Father, I have made known to you. You did not choose me, but I chose you, and I appointed you to go and bear fruit that will remain, so that whatever you ask the Father in my name, he will give you. This is my command to you. Love one another.
So there we go. And this, I say this more than I should, maybe this is one of my favorite little episodes in the Bible. This is the Last Supper. And why are we doing this? Well, because we've done Passover. This is happening at Passover, but now this is us. This is Easter. And Jesus is having this Passover. And as Mary said, everyone else waits until the next day, and they slaughter lambs all day long. They're supposed to be doing it the night before. So when he tells his disciples, go get a lamb and prepare it, as Mary said, you would think, well, maybe they would say, well, no, we don't do that. We take it to the priest. He's doing Passover the way it was supposed to be done. And it makes it sort of unique. And there may be other people doing it. I don't know. But he does Passover as they were supposed to do it. And they're going to have their intimate group. But they sit down to this meal. I hope I can give you some idea that he knows he's about to die. He knows he will be leaving this group of people that he loves. And he's got to leave them with a little bit of last information. I mention it from time to time. Moses did it. Joshua did it. The prophet Samuel did it. I'm about to be leaving you. I want to leave you with this. And he tells these disciples, I no longer count you as servants, because a disciple, as this, it uses it, is a servant. If you want to be a disciple, you do what you're told. I no longer count you as servants. I count you as friends. You see how that changes everything that gets said after this? Because up until now, there's been an understanding. If I tell you something, you swallow it. You're the servant. You're no longer a servant. Why? Because a servant doesn't know the master's business. But now you know all of my business. You know, I've taught you. You know it. I can now treat you as friends. Now, this is, to me, the thought of being told that by Jesus is almost overwhelming. I count you as friends, okay? And then he says, a new commandment I give you. And that is the same word as the 10 commandments. That's the law. And he has used a term that tells them this is something new. It's a new commandment. This is something new. It's also a commandment. It's my commandment. And my new commandment is that you love one another. And I can't stress enough that there are certain words that are very revealing. And one of them, that one another, is this word that there's no gray area. It means each other. And he's talking to them. He's not talking to everybody. So my commandment is that you love one another. And he tells them, by this, all people, it says men, but we can say people, right? All men and women will know that you're my disciples if you love one another. Clearly, it's important that all people know they're his disciples, because this is his last word to them. All right? And so he is preparing for this sacrifice. This is the eve of Passover. And the new thing he is doing tells us this is not Passover anymore. This is a new thing. It's Passover, but it's also something else. Does that make sense?
Yeah, the covenant, God does not break the covenant with the Jews, but this is a new covenant.
This is a new covenant in my blood. And he goes through these things of telling them that this is what is required of you.
And as God told Moses, when you celebrate the original Passover, make sure your children remember this. And what Jesus is saying to his disciples at the Last Supper, do this when you gather together as often you do this in remembrance of me. Remember, tell the next generation, basically.
So if we look at Passover as this instruction that's given to the Jews, to Israel, are we Jews? Are we Israel?
No.
No, but we're one part of the body.
We are one part of the body, but that covenant is not with us. It just isn't. And this,
We do
he
it, this
says,
covenant is.
Which covenant?
The one
original-
from the
Love one
original.
another?
the Exodus,
No,
the
the
Mosaic
Exodus.
covenant, the one that is part of Passover. And what he tells them, and this I can see, this is a thing that I know people struggle with, but he sits at this table and he says, look, there's something new going on here. This is a brand new covenant starting right now. You know, God makes the covenant with Abraham, and he says, this here and now, this is a new covenant in my blood. And the one thing he tells them is, as often as you do this, remember me. That's not intended. I have gone through it. I'm convinced it's not intended to mean once a year at Passover. And it's not intended to mean once a week at Sunday morning. As often as you do this breaking of bread that we've had here, remember me. That's what's required of us. That's what is expected of us. The first Passover, they got a whole list of requirements, didn't they? On that this hour of this day, go do this, go do, and it set up something though that perfectly foreshadows what's coming here. And he says, now this time it's my blood. With Abraham, the life of the son was required, but a sacrifice was provided. Yes?
Yes.
With us,
Sacrifices required.
a sacrifice is provided. We had no hope of providing a sufficient sacrifice. And he says, a sacrifice is provided. This is something. So we have Passover these other weeks, and now we have what we call Easter. Now we have the thing that Passover was there to point us towards. And it all comes together, and he literally tells them at the meal, this right now, this moment begins a new covenant. And when he says, and here's another thing that we've mentioned, but when he breaks the bread, remember, it's a cracker. He's not taking apart a loaf. It's a matzah. And when it says he breaks it, it's, you know, this is my body. He says, well, this is my body broken for you. When we celebrate communion, anytime any of you are any place that celebrates communion, nobody else can break a piece of bread and say, this is my body. That's a thing that only he was able to do. So whatever it is that we do during communion is not exactly, we remember, we commemorate. And what does he say? He says, you're my friend. He just told them, I count you as friends. And John tells us, he says, you're my friends if you keep my commands. Well, that sounds ominous. If I don't do what you tell me, I'm not your friend anymore. You're my friend if you keep my commands. And this is my command. He says it twice. He says it the first time that Mary read, and then he says it again this other time where he says, this is my command, that you love one another. The Greek word is alelos, and it literally means all of you back. Okay, now this is not ambiguous. We mostly never got taught this, but he's very explicit at that Last Supper table that says, I'm starting something new here. This is about to happen tonight. This is a new covenant, and I have one requirement for you, that you love one another. He doesn't set down 10 commandments because he says this commandment is greater than those. We've been prepared for this. We've had the story back in the gospel where the guy says, which one of the commandments is the greatest, right? None of this is a surprise, and yet it passes over us too often. This is my command, that you love one another.
So going back to Scott's thing, when he says, what are we supposed to do for Easter? We don't have to do anything, and we have to do everything. I mean, the new command was to love one another. So talking about doing everything. I did want to touch a couple things in
I talked
Acts.
too much today. Yeah, let's see if we can get to Acts, and I'll try and be silent.
Well, no, you don't have to be silent. So what have we done with this? So we make this Last Supper communion, and I would say we have done the same things as the Jews did for thousands of years, changing Passover. We've changed the Last Supper. So I'm trying to figure out, how do we get to this weekly thing, and how do we get, and so I went back to figure out where Christian churches take the Bible and say, this is where it was said. So if you look at Acts 2, verses 42, And this is the early church. So Jesus has been resurrected and now the believers are spreading the gospel. It says they devoted, this is the disciples, they devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching and to fellowship, to the breaking of bread and to prayer. That breaking of bread?
Break bread with somebody is a term that just means you eat a meal with them.
That is not the same,
It doesn't mean Passover, breaking of bread. Have a meal with somebody. Let's sit down and break bread together, right? You've all heard the term. That's all that is. And there's
and
actually,
it's a different word for bread than when Jesus took the bread. When Jesus took the bread and broke it, that was the unleavened bread. In Greek, those are two different words. That bread and this bread are two different words.
the bread at Passover has a peculiar name. And in the New Testament, it uses two different words. The breaking of bread is simply sharing a meal with each other. Before I got so sick, one of the things that Mary and we had a couple of discussions that we should be having more people over from this group to just eat together, to break bread together. It is a part of who we are supposed to be. Eating is a very intimate thing. And you know, that was, we had always said that was something we need to do here, and we haven't gotten around to it. So it says they devoted themselves to the breaking of bread. And I'm going to promise you, they're there to study, they're there to fellowship, they're there to break bread. I'm going to promise you that each time they broke bread, they remembered him. This is the new Passover. Effectively, this is the new covenant. And he says, as often as you do it, well, what were they doing? They're together breaking bread. It's not like breaking the cracker. You're having a meal together. And as often as you fellowship as a body, 2 of you, 20 of you, remember me. This is the remembrance. This is the parallel to Passover that is all about a remembrance of God's deliverance through the sacrifice, right? This is exactly the same thing. And he establishes it. He tells them, when you do this, remember me. And here we are in Acts, and they have established, they dedicated themselves to, you know, study, but the breaking of bread with each other, to this fellowship. Yes, sir.
And why not? Not with someone else, but with you when you break bread, when you eat.
Yourself?
Yeah.
It's a good question. Mario asked, well, why just when you get together with each other, and why not just when you're by yourself? Obviously, you should when you're by yourself. Yes, Gene?
Because of this. You
Oh,
gotta have two.
There is something.
Yeah, but
and
you
this
have
is-
a, this is a
One like me.
relationship with God. It's a one-to-one relationship. And so
Let me
yes, we-
answer that for you then, because I have an answer. I have an actual answer. And Mary says it's time, and I didn't let her get to the rest of
That's
Acts.
right. That's right.
So, remembering to be thankful to God when you're by yourself, before you eat, is a good thing, but it's not the same thing. This thing he establishes says, well, you get together, and when you do this, remember me. This is an ordinance, if you will. This is something he has established, but he's definitely not established it to only happen in a church. How do we know that? Because what she just read out of Acts wasn't in a church, was it? It was in a home. And they got together and they broke bread. And I'm saying, I promise you, even though it doesn't say the words, they remembered him. Why? Because they're there to study. They're there to be taught about him. This is the new Passover. This is the new covenant that's established. And over, week after week, we wind up talking about the importance of the body. You look at the people at home, this is very strange to us because we're not all here in the same room. And yet, isn't that always the case? Weren't they always celebrating Passover at the same time so that they could, in a sense, be together? Isn't that the design? He's created something here for us, a body, through his sacrifice that brings us together. And the parallel between this and the Passover as it was intended, you can't get around it. What's required of us at Passover? Love one another. And look at the faces look at the little empty boxes that just have like iPhone 5 on them. They're all part of this. They're all part of this body, along with a lot of other people. But we've chosen to get together, and it is one of the struggles that I have trying to figure out how we make this work from a distance. Kelly is in Canada with none of us. She's, you know, physical pain and everything else, and yet I until she says otherwise, she's part of this body. Even if we don't see her today, and if we only see her online, I don't know exactly how we do some of the things as a body via Zoom. It's weird for me. And yet I have no doubt we've come more and more to see, between whether it's emails or phone calls or people, you know, letting us know about each other, it's a body. That's who the Jews were at that time. They were one people. So it's not the same thing. And you want to go?
No, that's
okay.
They
And
were
I'm
one
sorry.
people before Jesus.
What's that?
They were one people before Jesus.
And are we not told? Does John not tell us that Jesus was here before the beginning, and everything that's been created was created through him? And anything that he didn't create hasn't been created, basically, right? So they were one people before. Yes, they were, and that is what we're supposed to see. They're joined, but this event that happens in Jerusalem, it was always pointing to that. The original Passover always takes us down to this once for all sacrifice in Jerusalem. And you know, I haven't done it justice because it takes a lot of time, but you can see the connections, right? Jack, you got something you want to say? All right. We have one more week. You want to talk about it?
Yeah, so we're gonna do next Sunday. We're not gonna do Easter Sunday because we're going to be in Tucson with our grandbaby. But we will do a recording for Easter Sunday. Next Sunday, we're gonna do a communion service.
I hope some of you can forgive us, because I know this will make some people uncomfortable, because a lot of us have grown up being told that communion only happens in the church and only priests may dole it out, right? Now, you see Jesus' Last Supper. It's not at the temple. Everyone else in Jerusalem is having Passover administered by priests. And I say everyone, maybe there are other exceptions, but you get the idea. Look at the town. The priests are doing the Passover and sort of just here, it's ready made, you just take it. Jesus' Passover had no priest involved, none, unless you count him, which we should.
Priest.
Yeah, but we'll get to that. Hopefully we'll get to that next week. But my point is that the established, you know, thing, none of them are involved.
So if you're not going to be here in person, we'll send out an email earlier in the week, which means I have to get my act together. So, but look for an email earlier in the week than usual.
And we will attempt this. Bread is okay. Why? Because, you know, if you have a chance to get matzah, get matzah. That's not the point. We're talking about this idea of breaking bread together and remembering. And so next week, if you can tolerate it, we're going to do this. If you want to use grape juice instead of wine, use grape juice instead of wine. It's okay. But we're going to try and do a thing, and we will, for the ones that are online, we will, you know, I would love to include as many of you as are comfortable. But if we're going to talk about Easter, and we're going to talk about Passover, and we're going to look at Jesus' Last Supper, there's a model there for us. So we're going to try this. And again, I hope it doesn't offend anyone too much, but that's going to be part of what we do next week. Anything else?
That's it.
God, I've spent a month or more being sick, hurting. And then to have this sort of deliverance that I don't even understand. But it reminds me of how many people just in this little group are in pain. The comfort, the deliverance comes from you. But I also know that you put us here and said, "You're my hands." You are literally my body. And you put us here to help, to comfort, to literally be your hands with these other people. And each week we look around at this group of people. How do we do that? You've told us that we're part of a body. How do we be a literal body? And it's a thing that can only be answered by you. And so we look for that. We seek the meaning and we seek the ability, the will, the desire to do those things, to be your hands in a world that very much needs your grace. And we're your agents for doing that. Remind us as we go into Easter. Begin to lay on our hearts, begin to point us, send people that remind us of our purpose, of what you laid out from the beginning and how we are part of that. And help us to not forget that the one piece of all of this that can't be replaced, it can't be changed, it can't be watered down, is the sacrifice that gets performed through your Son at this time that we're studying for us. Those ones that we've prayed for, we continue to. And through the week, we don't forget. We know that some of this is just a part of living in this temporary place. But that doesn't mean that we don't ask for comfort and we don't ask for healing when it fits the plan. Always remind us and always help us to be thankful, to remember that you love us and that you always have. And when we go through those hard times, you're there with us. Amen.
Thank you, guys. I hope you all have a good week and look for an email about Wednesday from me. That gives me a timeline.
What's going on Wednesday?
Okay.
Somebody doesn't know what Wednesday is. You want to repeat it?
Wednesday, I'm gonna send out an email earlier, just to tell you about Sunday. So look for those of you that get that. Thank you, guys. Have a good week.
Have a wonderful week.
Thank you.